Good morning, David. Lovely to see you. This is the fifth of our conversations on Edward Feld's book, The Book of Revolutions, how the battle of priests, prophets, and kings birthed the Torah. We have walked through the three codes, and we've come to this day when we wanted to think a little bit about the implications of what Feld has helped us understand, the implications for our own time and our own place. And this raises many questions for us, questions of tradition, where tradition is, questions of how we read the text, questions of the nature of the other and the significance of the other. For both of us, I think both of us have spent a fair bit of time, you an enormous amount of time, walking with Martin Buber and with Abraham Heschel, thinking about how the narratives of the Torah speak to us and inform our world. But for both of us, as I think we talked about early on, we tended to skip over the Holiness Code and Leviticus. And we also were, well, this is my words, a bit uneasy with the law. And part of that comes from our Protestant heritage. Part of it comes from our own churches, where we saw over time how a living tradition got colonized by moralism. So it creates its little blind spots for us. So with Feld, he helps us see the kind of dialogical landscape as also one that involves the law or the instruction, and the way in which that unfolds through Sinai, through the covenant code, into the highly articulated period where kings and priests and temple reigned, and then again into that period when all that disintegrates, and there has to be a new kind of integration, a new understanding of what does the living word say to us in our time and place. So we have so much to think about, and it's been lovely for me to be able to walk with you, think with you about Feld's book, out of your own rich understanding of these things. But today is, what is it, the 5th of February, 2025. Well, we're grateful to having reached this day, despite its demands. And yesterday, it became so vivid to me how significant all these matters are. When I listened just a little, because I'm disciplined about this, I've learned something from the monastic tradition about guarding your ears and your eyes. And these days, I am exercising it with a certain amount of vigor. But I did listen a little bit to what President Trump had to say, and Prime Minister Netanyahu when they met yesterday at the White House. And it put such an edge on this suggestion, casual suggestion, made as if it wasn't about human beings' lives, that America should take over Gaza, that the people in Gaza, Muslim, Christians, secularists, atheists, all of them simply need to go someplace else. So it puts enormous, and I don't want to make too much of it, but it highlights for us just how easy it is to lose a sense of the personhood of others, a sense of their place, how easy it is to be drawn in to what you deem political expediency based on your own passions. And then when I think, David, of the Christian communities which I have affection for, and the degree to which they, many of them, really going back to the 19th century and the development of Christian Zionism, how they, in their way of reading the scripture, in the kind of theological cathedral they built, how that blinded them to the reality of, in fact, in that tradition, the reality of Jews and Muslims, indeed other Christians, and at least became a significant factor in setting the stage for what has unfolded in Palestine at this point. So this morning, as we begin this, I just wanted to take a moment to reground us in the reality of various forms of idolatry and how those forms of idolatry create unbelievable blindness and perpetrate pain throughout the world. I think of Martin Buber and his going to Palestine, his way of thinking about Zionism, and of course so many others, and what unbelievable grief they also feel from the eternal in this particular moment. At the same time, the Torah is a living word, and it's a living word for you and me as well as for Jews and other Christians. And Feld has helped us glimpse again that living word. So perhaps we could begin by reflecting a little bit, if you would, on, in a kind of summative way, on how this book and Walking with Feld has enlivened your sense of this as a living word, and what the several demands that emerge from that as you've thought about it in such a serious way over the last several months.
Yeah, I was struck as you were introducing the prejudices that we bear and have been taught. Buber has this wonderful essay on how does the modern person approach even the text. And he says, well, of course, this is an all I-thou relationship, you must approach it as if you've never read it before, as you must encounter a person who you think you know, but who you barely know, so that you're aware of how much you're reading into the narrative, how much you're avoiding. And of course, certain you know these people more than I do, the kind of hermeneutical tendencies to, oh, yes, that's right, we have to know something about our subjective viewpoint. But that's not what he's talking about. In fact, he's highlighting the importance of that subjective viewpoint. He's talking about prejudice.
Yeah.
And I was taught as a Protestant, a good Protestant, liberal Protestant, that you can't follow the law. Nobody can follow the law perfectly, that's what was demanded. And therefore, it necessitated grace. And that faith was not based on law, but on grace brought through the death and resurrection of Jesus. But I had this prejudice that there is this law here that we can't follow. And so what's its purpose? And of course, that had another effect, which is that we have, therefore, not taken seriously, I think, except in some places and with some persons, the seriousness of the teaching of Jesus and how grounded that teaching is in the very Torah that we think we can't follow. And he's saying we have to. There's all sorts of, so what we've been cut off from both is a complete misunderstanding of Judaism and therefore a kind of self-righteous vindication of our own religious faith as something that has evolved out of the heaviness of law and into the joy and buoyancy of grace.
He said, I came not to destroy the law, but to
Right.
fulfill it.
Right.
So speak about that. Gesturing fulfillment.
Right. And of course, this is the drama in many ways, that the struggle, I would say, practice, intention, devotion, with all the mechanisms in place early on in the biblical tradition of repentance and turning to teshuva and tikkun and repairing and returning. And we see this operating in the way Feld is describing, how these communities, how these various voices in these communities through a long period of time have continued to do something with this original, and that's not even appropriate to say that, a code. And he goes directly in a similar way that I've just introduced, that most people still, it's a single-minded unitary story. It's creation, we have the patriarch narratives. We get to Egypt, we come back, we settle the land.
They build it into a kind of system, historical system, theological system, spiritual system.
Right. And what we fail to see is that the presentation of the narrative, we'll get to the codes, is in fact diverse and varied, spread out over a long period of time. But if you were to tell the very people who you were describing, who have built this cathedral and are to the text, it violates that fundamental assumption that it's one story dictated to human beings. And that, of course, makes it impossible to develop an interpretive or dialogical community with the text and with each other as persons who say we stand in the biblical tradition. So what we have noticed, I think the great addition of Feld's work is to take what we have come to understand in terms of narrative and even Psalms. We can spread the Psalms across the hundreds of years, and sometimes because they're attributed to that. So you've got the 137th, there we are, that we sat down, and hung up our harps. And then you've got some earlier enthronement psalms that seem to be, so there was a certain sense of gathering understanding that this was not a unified text. It was written over a great deal of time. It has editing and redaction, but so much of that academic community got caught up in having them to teach that, as opposed to simply let it be experienced in the active reading of the text, so that we didn't have to resolve all these contradictions, even though there's something in us that wants to do that. We didn't have to carve up the text, that if we read the text, and particularly the narratives well, as people like Robert Alter suggest, we discover that out of this tapestry, there's a kind of beautiful interwoven wholeness. And that wholeness is what comes across in Feld's book when we come to the law.
So if I can just, is the opposite of unity and reading it as a unified text, is the opposite of that this emerging wholeness?
Yeah, I mean, he writes very clearly, and this is a quote: "The Torah in its inclusiveness allows for the legitimacy of all our varied feeling and motives throughout a lifetime and lifetimes. The Torah not only validates this internal pluralism, it also ensures that no single overall interpretation of Judaism will triumph."
Yeah.
That's a huge and essential hedge against the kind of authoritarianism and doctrinal, what I mean, to know that means there's other voices, and that these voices are not in a hierarchy of, who's really standing on Sinai and who's not, and all of this. This Torah is created and engaged in the midst of the fires of history.
Yeah.
And by personalities of enormous proportions and profound feelings and orientations, much of which are counter to each other, but which are the lifeblood of the vitality that has kept this text alive. So, as we've discussed, once you understand that, I mean, really understand it, once you grasp it and let go of the fear that, there's nobody in charge but the interpretive community, that the Torah gives rise to the interpretive community, is the final point that Feld's trying to make.
And in some sense, wholeness is in the struggle itself.
Absolutely.
To make sense, to make meaning, to understand the complexity, and to hopefully let go of your idolatries.
Yeah, I mean, here's another quote from Feld at the very end of the book. "Through the expression of different, varying formulations, Torah is made whole.
Yeah.
As such, those of us nurtured by this inherited text called Torah are not meant to simply love each other along, you do it your way, alone, you do it your way, I'll do it mine. Rather, we are to engage each other, argue with each other, wrestle with each other over the rightness of our way, and finally, at our best, learn from one another." I mean, so it's not a plan for society that we bring to the Torah. Torah actually creates the very community by the way it is written, if we're careful readers, and if we learn to trust each other and our differences.
What's so significant in that for me is this clear sense of how significant it is. In fact, this struggle for wholeness, as you've suggested, is absolutely dependent on the other.
Yes.
It cannot come about in an insular way. It cannot come about simply within your own tribe, your own ideological tribe, or we would say also within your own church. The other and the conversation with the other is at the heart of the matter.
Right.
And when institutions, you mentioned the great personages at the heart of the Torah. But what we also see, and what Feld does an amazing job of it, is to see that, not in a judgmental way, that institutions are developed, and they're developed for obvious reasons. We want to pass on our understanding. So institutions are developed, including these three codes. And the temple, the priesthood, the guild of prophets, the anointing of kings. And it's not that that's somehow wrong, as our division that both you and I had of opposing law and grace, as if they were strangers to each other, or somehow one was at the center of human reality and the other one was extraneous and ought to be banished. But rather, these institutions that we create have their own kind of genius, but in the end, they're gesturing towards something. They're not themselves the point. And we have a habit of committing idolatry of them, of thinking they are it. Mm-hmm. Or, on the other side, of thinking they are the demon. And in that sense, we simply become romantically attached to our opposition.
Mm-hmm. And the narrative bears this out as it moves along in time and with these great personages. I mean, there are these battles.
Yeah.
And they're fierce, and there are consequences to these battles. And whether we're willing to step into the text and say, just a minute here, as we've talked about earlier, are we really going to say that it was a divine edict that they should kill all the Amalekite men, women, and children and animals?
Yeah.
Or did, as Buber suggests, Samuel misunderstand?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the level at which we are asked to engage this. Should Jephthah really hold on to his oath as a higher calling than saving his daughter?
Yeah.
And this is replete throughout the narrative. And if we get ourselves honed to be able to play in the narrative story and bring our own questions and unanswered, and talk with each other about this, then we get a certain sense of what he's after when he comes to the differences in the codes. Because here we are at the very heart of it. The first code is developed as Israel, according to the narrative, begins to filter into, much more than a flood, filter into this land of their ancestors. And there has always been other people there. And there's always been tension and also, moments of, without doubt, fellowship.
Yeah.
Now, who's going to tell the story? Well, what we find out with Feld as others, that much of that story is told by people at a time during the Reformation, during Josiah's Reformation, when they discover the scroll of Deuteronomy by the side of the throne, and by people who are trying to instruct a kind of nationalism. Because just prior to that, 10 of the tribes in the north had been extinguished by the Assyrian Empire. But we should not imagine and not forget to read that even in that story that's told by the southern historians, that there was constant civil war and battle between North and South.
Yeah.
And that the first covenant was actually developed and promulgated by the North, as Feld suggests, because it was the most sophisticated of the tribal confederacy. And they had been in all sorts of contact with Assyria and other tribes around them, and then it fell apart, as happens when empires want what they want. You know, we're just going to annex Gaza, and then we'll make it better. We'll turn it into Mar-a-Lago by the sea, and then we'll set up a subdivision in the Negev for the Palestinians, for 2 million Palestinians, and everybody will be happy. They're going to love these houses, you know. But the ferocity in which this struggle happens with the land gets translated into, okay, so how are we going to live with each other? And what does our own tradition say about that? So that even in the Deuteronomic Code, the second code that's promulgated during this Reformation, and wants to make it very clear who gets what, whose rights are the citizens and whose are the strangers. There still is in Deuteronomy, as there is throughout the rest of the other two codes, this insistence that how you treat the stranger. That's the most often quoted code in all three of them. And it's the most difficult, particularly when times are tense and tough, and when people want power, and they use the fear of the other to gather those forces, you know. And we see that played out. I mean, that's one of the things. I mean, reading Feld in many ways is a wonderful romp through a kind of historical narrative that we often miss because we don't set it in the context of these ever-changing, new formulations of the codes. But that's, I mean, what's going on right now is at the heart. What's going on right now today, as you describe it, will move them out. Where is that written? We would say, from our tradition.
So the Episcopal Bishop of Washington, when President Trump and his family and associates gathered for a service which was not billed as it was billed as a service of praying for the nation. When the Episcopal bishop gave her homily, she quotes from Leviticus 19.
Yeah.
Tell us about that. I mean, I watched that, and just one thing that really struck me about it is also her disposition. She was not in an aggressive disposition. She was not in a disposition of either or. She was in a disposition of appeal. So what did you see in that, and how did you? I mean, it was so striking that it was Leviticus that she invoked.
Right. And Leviticus 19, as we studied several sessions ago, Leviticus 19 begins the Holiness Code.
Yeah.
That was written while the community was in exile in Babylon. Now Feld speaks about these kind of counter voices in terms of now what do we do? What's the code by which we live here? And when we get back, what do we want to create? Which code do we want to follow? The Holiness Code, again, within the coded tradition, takes a step toward quite a different way of understanding how it is we should live with each other. So as she quoted, to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor, and to love the stranger are all the same. You love God by loving stranger, you love God by loving neighbor.
And you can't do one without the other.
You cannot do one without the other.
If you don't do one, the others leave.
Right. That kind of weaving together of the tradition is, of course, as we know it from the teachings of Jesus, just central to everything that he is and everything that he does, not just what he teaches, but the way he moves through these various provinces and from Galilee to Judea and meets centurions and widows and Pharisees and,
Samaritans,
Samaritan
lepers,
lepers,
women accused.
everyone. So that raises the other piece, let me tell you a moment that brought me to my knees. We were in the very heart of COVID in this country, and we were very quickly becoming split between who was going to be vaccinated and even more readily who would wear a mask. And there was a whole series of people who are clearly MAGA people and have this memory in their mind. You can't tell me to wear a mask. I'm not going to wear a mask. There's no mandate. I do not want to be mandated. Well, yet people were dying by the thousands and thousands and thousands every day. So if you don't have a mandate, then what do we do about the horror that's unfolding? And there was this moment when Anthony Fauci, who was in charge of the CDC at that point, said in an interview with journalists, "I don't know how to tell people to care for each other." And I immediately had the sense of Jesus in Jerusalem before his execution, saying, I really wanted this to be different. I don't know how. Now we're at the heart of the code. You get a sense from Feld, and you can catch it in the text as we discussed it, that code is a mandate. And the language of the mandate is command, 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 command. Why should I do this? Because I command you. And for all of the commands, it didn't protect the little southern community from being absorbed by Babylon. And one wonders, what was the nature of the observance, because it had been turned into a command. And we know something about that because we know that the behavior of Josiah against the others and against his own people was horrific, as most so-called, reformations are. We can't forget that after Elijah had this burlesque show at Carmel, they killed most of the priests of Baal. Well, what did they think was going to happen? So what did he prove, in one sense, which he has to wonder about while he's sitting alone in a cave afterwards? So the holiness code, and it's clear that this is where I think Feld is leaning because of the nature of how history and historic processes move, is that there is a reconsideration of how do we teach each other to care for each other and for the stranger that's in our midst. Where does that authority come from when we don't want to, or when we're fearful?
And for the people that we shaped out of our own mind as enemy.
Absolutely.
So during that, if we could just take another step into that, during that moment when you were brought to your knees, when Dr. Fauci, said he didn't know how to teach people to care. Fauci grew up in a good Italian home, good Catholics, went to a good Jesuit school, was taught by his father, who ran a pharmacy in New York, that when people come in during the Depression, needed medication, some might be able to pay for it, some might be able to pay a little bit, but his father would give it to them and say, well, pay me when you can. And these were a great diversity of people. They weren't all Italians. So he grew up with a concrete example of that, with a living word, I would say, in his father. And then the Jesuits put texture around that and taught him the larger dimensions of that. During that period, I had some young friends who I had gotten to know quite well prior to COVID. Very bright young people from a particular family. And at some point, towards the end of the crisis of COVID, they wanted to come over and talk. And we had a lengthy conversation. And I discovered that they had come to see the mandate in the way you describe folks in the States, many of them seeing it. I don't want to be mandated. This is the work of the devil. The state is impinging on my church. The state is impinging on my faith. The state is impinging on my person. On my person. They even want to inject me. As that conversation unfolded that night, as I listened as carefully as I could, wanting to understand how this had come about, that such bright, capable young people had come to identify with a set of fears, not illegitimate fears, but had come to take those on board thoroughly. They then told me about an uncle they had who also believed as they believed, as they has come to believe, and how that uncle got COVID, and how that uncle died. And they spoke about it, with some feeling for that uncle, but I realized I was listening to a narrative in which that uncle who lost his life in this period was now seen as a martyr to what they thought the cause was. He had given his life in order not to be, as they would understand it, imposed upon by the medical establishment or the state. I was flummoxed to see that martyrdom can be understood in that way. That's thorough. That is so, so thorough. And as you accounted it in a number of the biblical narratives, it can be so thorough that you will kill your daughter.
Yeah.
You will kill your future.
Yeah.
You will destroy the one you love.
Even though, we have one of the most profound texts in the Hebrew narrative where Avram takes up his son and intends to kill him, because that's done in that world. Children are sacrificed as they are today. So to have the hand withdrawn and say, don't kill your child. I mean, who didn't tell Jephthah the story that Yahweh is not the one, does not want the death of children? But he doesn't know the narrative clearly. And that's that sense of amnesia, which is rampant when you're not living in the narrative on a regular basis. You know, my grandfather used to say these readers in Sweden read so often and so well that those characters stopped their landscape.
Mm-hmm.
They're not in the landscape now. They're distant. You know, they're the forgotten ones, and therefore, you know, the narrative can't direct us, although it's right there.
That's why it's so stark when you realize that 40%, anyways, of Americans identify as evangelicals and do not go to church and do not read the text.
Right.
So you end up, I mean, evangelical for me is a beautiful word, like the word gospel, good news. But when you have replaced that with an exceedingly narrow and fear-driven and kind of immediate crisis, you placed yourself in the landscape of trauma. And so you can see nothing else. You can hear nothing else. There is not even a word that can be spoken that can be heard. And there's an unwillingness to read the text together. An unwillingness to read the text together. To say nothing about an unwillingness to come, let us reason together.
And that takes us to a really critical moment, it seems to me, David, which is if the holiness code is what really is being promulgated by this reformist priests and prophets, fairly small group at that point still, up against monarchists who want to restore the temple and the larger priest community. I mean, the question is, if this is a matter of the heart, how does one bring code into the heart? And here it really is, just as you just said, the heart in Hebrew, lavav, is the seat of understanding. It is the mind. It's not based upon, you know, I should do this, or I should even feel compassion, but to move into an understanding of what it is that we're actually asked to explore with each other in our human relationship, in a relationship to this tradition of which, you know, we're the inheritors. So the real revolution takes place when they return, and with Ezra, you know, and Nehemiah, the people sit outside and the city gates. This is where my little nonprofit gets his name. They sit outside the city gates, and the Torah is read to them. And the text says, and they came to understand, and they wept.
Yeah.
So
they came to understand, and they wept.
That's where it connects now into exactly the interpretive community that Feld leans toward at the very end of his book. In other words, the way this becomes a part of the heart is both the pluralism within the text, the recognition of the other, that we're sitting next to people who are reading differently than we are, and that this is the process of understanding each other, you know, so that the text, you know, and you could even say it, as many have, that what happens here is that the transformation in Babylon into the holiness code is a transformation from flesh, temple, to word. Now, the same word for temple worship, avodah, is brought in the rabbinic and burgeoning rabbinic world to study.
Yeah.
This is not a text that can be handed to us without our engagement.
Yeah.
It needs to be studied. It doesn't mean, as we do, because our mothers and fathers in Scandinavia weren't going to read the biblical languages and looking up, even though there were some great scholars among them, Wallenstrom included, but they were studying the text by reading it.
And reading it together.
Reading it together. That's how you learn how to care.
Yeah. So when you speak about the Hebrew in the Eastern Christian tradition, David, the telos of the spiritual life is to have the nous, the mind, descend into the heart.
Yeah.
And that's where understanding, and think of that word, understanding, standing under, can take place. The disposition that you spoke of about city gates, and they understood and they wept. That's a disposition of attentiveness, of recognition of finitude, of wonder, and of a sense that there's so much coming to greet you.
Yeah.
I think of the great Rabbi Hillel and his that account we have of, you know it well, that account we have of his student who had been studying the Shema with the great creedal text, and how the student comes to him one day and says, Rabbi, why is it that it says in the text, we must place these words in our heart? Why doesn't it say we should place these words on our heart? And the great rabbi says, well, indeed, in Hebrew, it is in our heart. But as you and I both know, in many English translations of that great narrative or a great text, great Shema of the Shema, it does say, place it on your heart. But in Hebrew, it says, place it in your heart. And Rabbi Hillel, as the story is told, ponders this, saying to the student, indeed, we are to place it in our heart. But he says to the student, alas, all we can really do is place it on our heart until one day our heart breaks. And then the words fall in.
Yeah.
That's the tears.
Yeah.
That's the recognition.
Yeah.
That's the breaking of the mental idolatry that is so ubiquitous with us. And it's not that it's bad, it's that it's not enough. If you do not read the Torah with a broken heart,
Right.
read the Torah.
Yeah.
Just projecting on the Torah your own passions.
I had a powerful moment with a man who came many years ago, whose son was coming out. And he was in agony about it because the text from his tradition was saying this is sin. And I can't accept it. And we struggle with that, and he struggled with it. In a real honest to goodness. And he came back in the last session quite changed by his work. And he said, it came upon me that I said to my son, I don't understand who you are. I don't understand how that works. I don't understand how you can love in the way that you're loving. But I've come to realize that I don't have to understand in order to love you.
Yeah.
I can love what I don't understand. And the realization was that once he had said that, then he understood.
Yeah.
This was not a head thing. It was not understanding the Torah is not getting it.
Yeah.
It's seeing the enormity of its capacity to change us and to create relationship where otherwise we couldn't imagine it. You know.
And to say to love God with all your strength, with all your mind, with all your heart. You do not know God. And when you do, it's an idolatry.
That's right.
So, right at the very heart of it. And then the second is like unto it, your neighbor as yourself.
Yeah.
You don't know all that's going on in your neighbor.
Right.
For God's sakes, we don't know all that's going on within our own heart and our own mind.
Right.
To shift that disposition so that love is not bound to knowledge, except to that kind of knowledge which in Hebrew is so vivid. The only real knowledge there is the knowledge in loving, in making love present in the world.
Yeah.
In the face of the mystery.
Yeah.
In the face of the mystery. So, David, maybe we could spend a few minutes and you could build a bridge for us. In Jesus Christ's most famous sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, where we have the Beatitudes, the beautiful, the references to what is beautiful in life, and where he must be looking at the people there and seeing someone who's beautiful because they're poor in spirit, seeing someone who's beautiful because they are meek, seeing someone who's beautiful because they love mercy, beautiful because they mourn, beautiful because they search for righteousness. And then he goes into that extraordinary consideration where he speaks about the law. It has been said to you. He doesn't dismiss it. And then he goes on to say, and I say to you. What I see in that, because that's often, as you know well, and within our inherited traditions, at times there were people that would read that as a kind of oppositional text. But what I see in it isn't a discounting of the law. It's saying, yes, you can commit idolatry with the law too. You can use the law against itself. But now I'm going to show you what the fulfillment of the law is all about, which is this transformation of your mind and your heart. So that when you looketh upon a woman, you see a person. When you look upon your enemy, you see a person. So could you say a little bit to us as we draw the threads together here about Jesus Christ as, and that text as one of the texts we read in light of the whole of the Torah, as a kind of midrash on the holiness code.
Yeah, and in other places, he's in keeping with Feld. You know, we don't have one versus the other. He's not choosing
Mm-hmm.
one or the other in the sense that we should not read the other. The other is now no longer valid. I mean, he will quote the young man who comes to him, what's the law? You should love the Lord your God with all your heart, and which is right out of the Deuteronomic Code, which doesn't mean that he's a Jewish nationalist. He's not on that side of it, and yet he understands that there's something here, but it needs to be brought out in terms of another way of reading it, even if it's only in that moment when he's teaching. What does it mean? What does this mean, really? Not just saying it, as we often say the creeds. What does it mean? How does it inform? How does it connect to love of neighbor and love of stranger? And he does it right there. And then he brings it to the stranger. And this most powerfully in the 25th chapter, just before he's executed, when he says, if you do it to the least of these, you're doing it to me. Well, when did we ever see you a stranger? When did we ever see you in prison? When did we ever, And here's the holiness connection. Be holy as I am holy. That the care of neighbor, care of stranger, care of me is one thing. You can't say, if I'm not caring for that widow in the street right now, I'm not caring for you. And so you don't get on your high horse and think that this is anything other than what I'm telling you, which is this is the Torah.
Yeah.
The cup of cold water to the stranger, to your enemy. You have heard that it was said, you shall love God and hate your enemy. And there is no Torah in that. But nonetheless, he clarifies that, as good teachers do.
Yeah.
You have heard that it was said eye for an eye. Yeah, there are statements like that, but there are other statements that say in the codes that doesn't work. If someone offends you, you don't get to offend. It's not retributive, So he stands in the tradition without a doubt, and we can see him standing also in the tradition of Hillel, who leans also in the direction of the holiness code, prefers to be with ordinary folks. Who doesn't, than the academics, and yet still stands in the whole conversation and debate, and is willing, and as we often see, and we often misinterpret, very actively promulgating a teaching that is meant to be transformative.
The heart of the matter, the attentiveness which is transformative and seen so vividly. I love the Torah text when Abraham is standing in the door of his tent with Sarah and sees the strangers and rushes to them.
Yeah.
Rushes to them.
Yeah.
Please do not pass by. Please do not linger. Let me give you something to eat. Let me wash your feet. Linger. And every such encounter is a revelation, is a moment of revelation. You're about to hear something new about your own life,
Yeah.
and about the life of the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think in terms of that's really clear, particularly in Matthew, whose narrative plot moves from episode to episode so brilliantly, that we're watching as the narrative unfolds from the Sermon on the Mount, so to speak. We see this in action. And so we understand something else that goes back to Ezra, which is the teaching of the law and of Torah is not about content. It's about teaching us to pay attention to what's happening, and as people like Sharon Salzberg, the Jewish Buddhist teacher, says, faith is really opening your heart to what is happening.
Yeah. And it's present to what's unfolding.
Yeah.
Without presumption. Without your own passions repainting the picture.
That's it.
Well, David,
I feel, in the end, I feel Buber's vision for this land, I think, is much more an original version from which is there shouldn't be two states. It should be one land, two peoples, and we need to learn how to live together. This is the drama that we've been reading about with Feld. And it's the other piece, that is so hard. How do we put that into action, into real action in terms of building communities that can live side by side? And I think we've been elucidating it a lot. And a lot of your work and my work has been thinking about that and feeling fearful about where things are at, which brings me to the last of the story. As Jerusalem is falling under the assault, the final assault of 3 years, and everything is about gone, and we're going to witness another total destruction of Jerusalem, the temple, untold numbers of people murdered. There's the story of Yohanan ben Zakkai, who has his disciples sneak him out in a casket outside the city gates as if he's dead. And when he gets up, he goes to Vespasian. They bring him to Vespasian. Vespasian says, inasmuch, what the hell do you want? And he said, give me Yavna. This is a little school off on the coast, a little place to go to bring students and to teach Torah. And one can argue that from that moment, very much like the moment with Samuel, the word of God was very rare in those days. Everybody did what was right in their own eyes. And what we've been moving toward and wrestling with is how do we not do what was right in our own eyes, but do something, to love each other in a way that is commensurate to the way we understand God loving us. But it has to be taught. And so here the biblical tradition, once again, seems fragile. But I don't know myself any other way to do it other than to pay attention to the children and to help them learn, and each other, but mostly children. That's where Jesus it seems to me, mostly was interested, is to pay attention to them, because only when the adults pay attention are we able to learn what it is that I need to know. Right now we're teaching them horror and a kind of selfishness, and as you call it, idolatry, that is going to bring, already has brought tremendous pain to much of the world. But there's this piece in the narrative and in the code that says, yet there is this. Go see where that's happening, because it is. That's how we got this far.
thank you, David.
Oh, thank you. Delicious. Hard and delicious, and lovely to be in conversation with you, David.
Great to see you. Talk again soon.
Okay.
Bye-bye.